Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on policies and practices for a future of flexible working. I'm Siobhan Bonita, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants here in the UK and all around the world, and in collaboration today with WT Partnerships. Now, even before the pandemic, there was lots of work going on in the civil service and public sector organisations to bring in more flexible working, but actually the pandemic really escalated that. And I think over the last 18 months, both organisations and staff have experienced some of the benefits that can be had through more home working, flexible working, hybrid working. And I think the future really is a hybrid working future. But that brings lots of challenges, lots of consequences as well for the way that we look at how we use our public spaces, how we use retail spaces, leisure spaces, and it has real implications for suburban high streets and neighbourhoods, for city centres, for the way that we plan our infrastructure up and down the country. And we'll be talking about all of those issues with our brilliant panel that we have with us today. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panel members. But actually, this is also an opportunity for all of you who are joining us, who are watching, to put your questions to that fantastic panel. So you'll see at the bottom of your screens, there should be a Q&A function. Please do at any point message in your questions. And once we've heard from our panel, we'll get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. Now, some of you might be familiar with Zoom, but you might notice there's a new function today on the Zoom platform. It's got live subtitles. If you like those, that's brilliant. But just to say, if they are distracting for you, you can actually, if you go to the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screens, you are also able to turn those off. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our brilliant panel. First up, we will hear from Dean Smith, who is Joint Managing Director of UK and Europe at WT Partnership. He's a chartered surveyor with over 30 years experience in facilitating innovation and providing practical strategic advice to a wide range of public and private sector clients, both in the UK and overseas. And he's worked with a whole host of organisations, including numerous NHS trusts, Manchester Airport, Ministry of Defence, Justice, and HM Courts and Tribunal Service, as well as lots of charity organisations. So it'll be brilliant to get the insights from his expertise and experience. Then we'll hear from Andrew Almond, who is a partner at Pick Everard, with 40 years experience in the construction industry. He's led major UK and abroad, including working closely with major public sector clients on strategic estate and digital information management. And he's currently partnership lead for Pick Everard's COVID task force and hybrid working initiative, so really does understand the issues we'll be covering today. Guthrie, who is Deputy Director of Workplace Experience and the Smarter Working Programme Director at the Government Property Agency. And pre-COVID, Kate led the Cabinet Office's work to support departments in putting flexible and remote working arrangements in place. And she's been closely involved in managing the shift to remote working throughout the pandemic. Then we'll hear from Tony Devenish, who is the West Central Assembly member of the London Assembly, a position he's held since 2021, and since 2006 has served as councillor in Westminster. Congestion, strategic infrastructure projects, and most recently, COVID recovery plans for the capital. Outside of politics, Tony had a long career in infrastructure and property, including as one of the youngest overseas general managers for Rolls-Royce. Actually, I made a mistake there. Tony was re-elected in 2021. He's been an Assembly member for much longer than that. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Kevin Murray, who is Managing Director of Meter Square Limited and is currently providing consultancy services to the Metropolitan Police Service. Previously, Kevin worked in the civil service, leading commercial property and estates projects, including at the Ministry of Justice, DWP, DEFRA, and the Cabinet Office. And he was a former chair of the Government Facilities Management Board. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a really stellar panel with us today. As I said, please do use this opportunity to send in your questions and get as much out of our panel as we possibly can in the time that we have. Now, without further ado, I'm going to invite Dean Smith to give us the first opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Afternoon. If we pop onto the next slide, please. Siobhan has given me an excellent introduction, so I probably don't need to say anything more beyond the fact that WT Partnership is an independent practice looking after FM consultancy project and cost management, generally in construction and property. I'm a chartered surveyor, as we've said, over 30 years experience, and I've had the great pleasure of working with a really wide range of clients over that time, many of whom Siobhan has mentioned, but some other odd ones in there, like the Zoological Society of London, amongst others. So I've had an extremely enjoyable career, and it's given me hopefully some good insight to some of the new challenges we're facing now. Pop on to the next one, please. Just very quickly about WT. So we are actually an international practice. We've got 72 offices worldwide. The kind of three main bases are UK and Europe, Australia and Asia, but with a relatively new presence over the last sort of 5 to 8 years or so in the US as well. And I welcome certainly other participants today that are joining us from overseas. A lot of the issues we'll be discussing hopefully will be just as pertinent for yourselves, and certainly with my colleagues we should have some good insight there as well. On to the next slide, please. Just a quick smattering of some logos. A lot of these have been mentioned by Siobhan. Also worth noting that we're delighted to have secured a position as a preferred partner to Perfect Circle on the recently announced new SCAPE framework, which enables us to provide our services and provide access to you as clients throughout the UK Business Services Procure Partnerships, Pagabo, ESPO, and other frameworks that we're on. Thank you. Next slide. So let's get down to the subject matter today. I think we all know that things are changing. I think, and that is the only certainty that we have at this point. Things are changing, hopefully for the better. I think there's a real sense of optimism, notwithstanding the fact that we managed to win a football match to get us into a final for the first time since 1966. Even without that, there is an optimism that's coming as COVID restrictions are beginning to lift, and actually born out of what, but we have been able to demonstrate that the technology is out there to enable effective remote working, and our resources, our teams, our staff are seeing the benefits of that, as indeed our own organisations I think have generally seen the benefit of that, not only for them for an improved work-life balance, but there's an improved environmental and social benefit as well. And I think that's now shifted to the next stage where there is an expectation for existing staff, but also for new people joining new organisations. They are expecting and looking. So that is a shift. I mean, that is a fundamental shift that probably shouldn't be understated. But we have to consider, and certainly from WT's point of view, we're interested in the implications that has on the infrastructure of society and the built environment. And certainly for everyone on the call that relates to public sector services, how those services are going to be provided to a wider society that has a more flexible approach and may not necessarily continue to be living obviously. I guess you have to question the importance of geography going forward. I mean, if technology enables us to work more flexibly, if technology enables us to work more remotely from a normal office space, well then, is geography an important issue? Is connectivity actually the new key? And certainly from a public sector and central government perspective, how does this affect the levelling up agenda? If geography is now taking a step back and connectivity is the more important point. But looking across the built environment, just to pose a few thoughts really, office space, there is a potential for office footprints to reduce because less space is required. More dynamic meeting spaces and flexible working spaces may be required. How does that fit in with the current office stock that we have? Residential, we are seeing the RICS is reporting a general rise and migration out of towns and cities and into more rural environments, spreading the distribution of the population. Is that going to continue? Who knows? But that is certainly the current trial was in a poor shape before COVID. It's had a significantly greater hit as a result of the pandemic. The inevitable and extreme rise of internet shopping, it was with us before March 20, but it's absolutely dominant now. So what does that do in relation to the demise of our town centres? And do we need to start thinking more of the rise of retail as a leisure activity rather than a pure retail activity? Leisure itself and the public spaces, as for opportunity, then they'll be looking for an increased higher quality of leisure facilities and public open space. And linked to all of that, if people are travelling less, well, what does that do for transportation? Are they going to be travelling less but over greater distances? How does that work in terms of our overall infrastructure? And putting all of that under the wing as well of where does this look against the green agenda and with the change anyway, with more electric vehicles, etc., and car charging. There's a lot of infrastructure questions to be answered. And this is important for all public service sector provision. And we fully understand that there are many public sector services that are geographically biased and geographically based. The frontline teams and colleagues that we have do have a geographical bias, but in practice, it suits the population they serve and the support functions that support them within the public sector. How are they going to evolve to deal with this more flexible approach in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean. I mean, it's a brilliant way to kick off there with your presentation, because I think you've set out the overall picture really nicely. The fact that the pandemic created this kind of step change in the way people view home working and flexible working. There have been challenges, but people have really seen the benefits of it as well. So it's definitely here to stay in some shape or form going forward. And then those really important questions that you've raised around kind of what's the impact on the built environment, what's the impact on public service delivery. And actually there really isn't an area of kind of public policy that isn't affected, everything from transport to housing to the environment. It raises big questions around those. So I'm sure our other panel members will pick up on lots of those points. So thank you so much, Dean. I'm now going to invite Andrew to give us his remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to where I'm working from today in rural central England, in my home office. Flexible working is going to have, or should I say is already having, a broad effect on our society. And I think it's difficult to talk about flexible working in isolation because it inevitably forms part of the broader picture of flexible living. So I want to talk about how that new way of working and living is likely to affect our cities and the ways in which we might need to adapt them in response to change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our urban fabric is a complex and multifaceted organism, with all of these elements that we see on the screen here being common to most, if not all, of our cities and our large towns. And we know that a number of these components are already undergoing significant change, as Dean has already spoken. But this isn't a new phenomenon. We are used to change, and industry has been undergoing almost constant change over many years. So over the last century, we've seen the face of our mining, motor, steel, and hosiery industries, just to name a few, all change unrecognisably. Next slide, please. And as Dean has said, that the retail industry, the retail sector, has been steadily shifting out of our high streets over the last 15 years, rated particularly by the pandemic. Towards the end of last year, the online shopping represented something like 28% of sales, which is quite a significant proportion. Next slide, please. I suppose the new kid on the block, if you like, in this respect is commerce, and particularly office workers, the migration of office workers to out of city centres to home. And of course, in March last year, almost as a flick heading off home, and has remained there pretty well since. And interestingly, looking at the statistics, whilst the retail spend and recovery in city centres has seen some strong and moderately strong recoveries in some cities, the picture in respect of workers' return is almost unanimously low across all cities. And it's difficult to know how that may change over the coming 12 months. But I think it's pretty safe to say that there isn't going to be a full to the position we were in pre-pandemic. For my own business, we employ 650 staff nationally, and the data that we've gathered internally at the moment shows that something in the order of only 10% of those people will be returning to a fully office-based work model in the future. And the remainder are going to be working hybrid. So it's a very rough indication, but I suspect that in the 12 cities where we have our offices, our own footfall in those cities is going to drop by something in the order of 30%. Next slide, please. So how do we adapt to this picture? I believe that the emphasis in regard to the purpose of cities is going to have to change. With office and retail particularly reducing, I think the other elements of the fabric are going to need to step forward to fill the void and replace the value, both in terms of the revenue flow and in terms of the capital value of property, which is going to obviously take a hit. We've seen Hammerson's not too long ago reduce their retail rents by 30%, which obviously is a massive going to be affecting the value of their property. Next slide, please. So although adaptation, I think, is part of that picture of moving forward, I don't think it's likely to fully address the full void that's being left by the migration of businesses away from our city centres. That void is going to demand some backfill. Next slide, please. So I believe that that city centres need to become centres of excellence. We've got to have centres of celebrated value, and I think that suggests that we need to see cities specialising more in the areas that they are good at and the areas that they have assets that already support. The retreat of national retailers opens the opportunity for local businesses, and I consider that to be a really good thing. They're a great source of vibrancy, variety, innovation, and they're fantastic for local identity. Space in city centres, both internal and external, I think is going to be absolutely essential. It adds just an enormous value. It attracts visitors, and it provides an essential foil for community engagement and cohesion. And I think it's going to require a positive action to achieve that. If we leave it to natural evolution, I think we can expect to see a repeat of the localised decay we've experienced, where the nucleus of individual cities has shifted in respect to changing gravity. In my own local city, less 70 years, we've seen the nucleus of the city move right away across the city centre, leaving the area that in the early 20th century was one of the richest, now very evidently one of the poorest. So we've also got a chance to create new local communities served by local businesses and given that local pride and identity. So it's essential that we have joined up thinking around all of that. Next slide, please. So in the final slide, just talking about what I think we need to do going forward in terms of encouraging the move forward. So I think we need a planning strategy, not just making development easy, but a structured approach to encourage the right type of development in the right place and of the right quality. I think we need to look at integrated and cohesive urban structure plans to ensure that the disparate elements and attributes of our cities collaborate to collectively deliver an impact and a value that is collectively greater than the sum of the parts. I think we're going to need to see significant city centre investment to support all of that, incentives to businesses to enable them to establish and draw footfall. I believe that it's imperative that whatever investment and initiatives we bring forward have got to support all four legs of the table, not just any one of them. So in summary and close, I think yes, we're going to face significant change, and yes, there are going to be some challenges, but importantly, I think there is a huge opportunity right now to improve the way that we live and to better align the built environment in which we live to support that method of modern life going forwards. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. I mean, that really built nicely on what Dean had said in terms of showing some of the real impacts on the city centres there and how different aspects will maybe come in to fill other ones that are now moving out maybe to local hubs. But I really liked what you said at the end there about the importance, you know, there are challenges here, but there are some real opportunities. But actually now is the time for government to make sure they have the strategies, the plans and investment in place to capitalise on some of this. Otherwise it will just drift, I think. So it'll be interesting to see if the audience have questions about that. Thank you so much, Andrew. And now I'm going to ask Kate to give us her thoughts.
Thanks, Siobhan, and good afternoon all. Really great to join you here for today's event. So I'm Kate Guthrie. I'm the Deputy Director for Workplace Experience and the Smart Working Programme Director at the Government Property Agency. So we are an executive agency of the Cabinet Office, and our vision really is to create great places to work in the London region, but also out in the cities and towns of the United Kingdom. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just looking at some of the learning that we've gathered through the pandemic, through some of the surveys that we've used across the civil service, and then really think about and talk through how we're using that learning to shape our plans, to shape our thinking around the future of work and the future of the office space. Next slide, please. So in terms of our learning, and it's probably important. So we undertook a survey, and it's important to note this really and think apply this, I guess. So we undertook a survey last year. 25,000 civil servants took part from 34 departments and agencies, so a really rich source of data. And the survey was really looking at how people were impacted by working from home, how well they were able to continue delivering their role, how productive they felt, and also looked at things like their well-being, their mental health, and also particularly about their home environment and how well their home environment did. As I mentioned, I need to caveat it, it was last year. The situation has obviously moved on significantly since then. Having said that, though, we did undertake another small survey this year, and the results were really quite similar. And we've also established a business reference group. So it's hosted by the Government Property Agency within the civil service, and its members include organisations such as some of the large consultancies, Nationwide, Aviva, Bank of England, Microsoft, and some of the large estate organisations as well. And we're using that group to really share our thinking, to share our experiences. And really our findings, although last year, haven't really changed, and many of the themes that we identified last year are very similar to other organisations, so we're quite confident in using this data. But on this side, you can see that there are some real differences. So things like productivity, knowledge, sharing of information, use of technology, all stayed relatively high in terms of how well the home environment supported those activities. Have been working at home during this period, and those of you that may be at the event from, you know, a variety of departments, I guess, that deliver a variety of roles, you'll obviously be aware that many of those roles have still continued to be delivered within the normal workplace. But for those working from home, the key message has been that for many people and for most people, the home environment has continued to support productivity, knowledge and use of technology. A couple of areas that are slightly more challenging, however, around connection, so connection with colleagues, the organisation life balance. And I don't know how many of you on the call feel, but you know, working from home, not being able to always make that distinction between home and work and the office can be quite challenging. We also asked people around their preferences for the future, and we found that pre-COVID, most people on average worked about 1 day a week at home or in other remote locations. Post-COVID is quite a different picture, and we were seeing sort of returns of around 3 to 4 being the average day that civil servants would prefer to work at home to maintain a healthy work-life balance, but also to deliver their business needs. is a preference, and there's lots of work, as you can imagine, now going on across government to really understand, well, what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of the use of our buildings? Homework setting was critical. So the more private the setting you have at home, the more positive your experience has been. Those were dedicated on. Really important there to think about the differences that individuals are facing and what many leaders may need to think about. Activity-based working, so really critical. Some activities much better delivered at home. So those that are about acoustic privacy, so concentrated activities, quiet, confidential activities. However, those that require social interaction, connection, just seeing colleagues, much better supported in the office. And then role complexity, so those that have more things to deliver, more activities on a daily basis, found the experience a much more challenging experience from our data. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of sort of, how we're applying this learning? Well, from a people perspective, we are creating a framework. As you can imagine, the civil service isn't one single employer, so it's quite challenging, I guess, to come up with something that works for everybody. So we're creating some guidance that departments can then use to support and develop their own policies and types of workers, which you can see on the screen, different types of ways of working. What we're not doing is boxing people into those. We don't want sort of this to be a rigid approach. We want to be really flexible, really informal. People can move between those different types of workers. What we're probably not looking at is a massive increase in formal home working, though. We think that sort of hybrid worker will be where we'll see many people, and obviously many continued in their workplace as well. Very much a framework, and individuals and team leaders and managers with rich conversations. There's lots of guidance that support each of these ways of working. And we're starting off in this way. We will see how it works. I'm not sure everybody's got the answer yet, but we will test and learn as we go. Next slide, please. So just to show you sort of the evolution, I guess, in thinking, how are we applying this thinking to our workplaces? Well, it doesn't matter that you can't really see the detail of the design here, but we've, I guess, evolved our thinking from very traditional, lots of focused desks, very small collaboration space, through to just before COVID, we were really starting to think differently about this, through to now a sort of post-COVID world where we flipped the thinking around workplace design. We think desks are still very important. The number one activities in our survey that civil servants said they deliver, but actually, or concentrated focus activity at a desk was the number one activity. But we think the workplace is going to be much more about that informal collaboration, networking activity. So we've switched the design of our workplaces. Much lower percentage of desks, 34%, a much higher percentage of those informal breakout spaces. Again, we have to monitor how them, but I think it's the right place to start. And as we see more and more people return to the workplace, we'll keep testing whether we've got this right. Next slide, please. So we're building our digital offer as well. This is really important. We can't, we can put in place the right workplaces. We can really work with individuals about ways of working and principles. But Dee mentioned it, technology and the development of technology is critical. So there's much we're doing in terms of developing our offer around technology, working with departments, things like booking your place in the building, putting in place occupancy sensors so we can see what are the popular types of work settings. Is it desk? Is it breakout spaces? And we can start to learn from that and switch things around if needed. But lots of different work going on across government so that civil servants can move between buildings with ease, and that we can really connect with one another wherever we are in the country. Final slide, please. So really, key message, cliche message, but really relevant, I think. Sustainable change does take time, it does take effort, but we have such an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to enhance well-being and productivity. We have an opportunity to create a really flexible civil service. We're really focused on business need and driven by business need. And that's the key message I think that needs to come through, that this is about business first, but that means that we can balance that business need with individual needs as well. We want to build our plans on what works well and a what works well mentality. So if things aren't working, we can adjust, we can adapt, but we need the data to be able to test and get the evidence on what's working. And we want to benchmark. Everybody's going through this experience. We want to learn about what others are doing. We want to share what we're doing to create that sort of modern civil service. So we'll keep sharing. But overall, I think Dean mentioned this is a great opportunity to support the Levelling Up agenda, the Places for Growth programme that you might be familiar with, and enable the sort of inclusivity and sustainability elements of smarter working, and overall really try and create a really brilliant model civil service. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Siobhan.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. It's really good to have that slightly different perspective there, where you've focused on what the experience has been like for colleagues and shown how you've done that research and really listened to what officials have been. And also, I think what you said there supports so much what the previous panelists have said in terms of people are saying the future is hybrid. So it's not that everybody wants to stay at home. There has been challenges for some people, but actually the majority of people seem to want to do some kind of mix going forward, which will have all of the implications and the consequences that Dean and Andrew have talked about. And then finally, really good to bring in those other aspects of what does this mean for workplace design, for how governments use their buildings and public sector organisations use their buildings. And nice to see at the end, you're talking about technology and a data-led approach in terms of what works. So bringing in all those new aspects. Thanks so much, Kate. Tony, I'm going to come over to you now.
Hi, Siobhan. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm hugely positive about the future, more so even before last night's football. I won't go through every word on this slide. Siobhan already introduced me, but I had the honour of representing the inner part of West London. I've been targeting during COVID, trying to reopen Hammersmith Bridge, which once we get past complete flexible working and many of us get back to the office, we're going to need that bridge reopened. I also particularly specialise on the environment, in housing and on police and crime. Those are the mayor's main responsibilities, as well as transport, and particularly issues such as the congestion charge, for example. I'm a long-term Westminster City Councillor, and I am actually still the environment spokesman for my party at the GLA. But like a lot of people, I've had a portfolio career, and I did have real jobs in business for 30 years. So I do understand that whether you're on the public side of life or you're breathing monthly P&L, every perspective is so important. And one thing I should always say, being a London representative, is please don't wait until at least September to experience coming back to the office. If you are based at least part-time in London, do come and see our great city. Do come and enjoy the theatre, the football, the pubs, the restaurants, etc., etc. Next slide, please, Siobhan. So as I said, and I think I agree with everything everybody on the panels said, flexible working is here to stay. All that's happened, terrible things that have happened during COVID in terms of the nation's health, but in terms of COVID non-health issues, all its trends, many of them go back at least to the 2007-8 economic crash, and many before. Businesses and the public sector have been in a state of change for many years. And as I give the example of World War II, that really, as you know, as we increased the state during World War II to win the war, the welfare state came out of that and the post-war consensus. And I believe all the things we're talking about today are just accelerating trends that really started to some extent with the creation of the World Wide Web, as it used to be called, 30 years ago, actually in 1989, the year I started work, the year the Berlin Wall came down. And now having the IT tools that comes from that means that we can work more flexibly. The high street isn't going to die. People keep on talking about the death of the high street. So I wanted to say it's not going to die, but it is already evolving. I'm seeing in Oxford Street, there are going to be more large-scale hotels, for example, and there's going to be less square footage of conventional retail, although retail will still be a substantial part of main streets such as Oxford Street. But also I've been quite amused as a man whose children are now grown up, that I do think this generation is the first generation where men I know in the workforce are pulling their weight far more in terms of bringing up children. That's good, obviously, but it does mean that being in the office at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning or at 8 or 9 o'clock at night is crazy for many people, quite rightly. And you can just jump on a Zoom call, which is what we've all been doing during COVID and well before COVID for many of us. Good news in terms of London specifically, TfL do expect passenger numbers to get back to at least 90% of the pre-COVID period by next spring, probably March. So a 2-year lag, but by next March, hopefully. At the moment, just to give you some basic figures, tube capacity is about 40% of pre-COVID, bus capacity is about 60%, and car capacity, though, we have had a bit of unfortunately, a car-led recovery. That car capacity is running at 100% or a little bit lower or a little bit higher. And you probably saw the scenes of the football last night. That is a good example of the peaks and troughs of London going forward and our cities. But our cities aren't going to die, as I say, they're going to evolve. And I do believe the levelling up will help the rest of the country. So it can be, if we do this properly, it can be very much a win-win. But there will be challenges, as my colleagues on the panel have mentioned. One stat I've picked up from business, that there's been various surveys, that many businesses in the West End particularly believe that we could have a 40% reduction on footplate in terms of offices. So people will stay, big business and the public sector will stay in central London, but they're going to reduce the overall size of their footprint. And obviously that's going to have knock-on effects. In terms of what we're doing in Westminster City Council, we are trying to drive footfall, hence the request that you do come in at least some of the time, please. And for example, we're building, some of you may have heard of the Marble Arch Mound, which is a huge site. As it says, it's a mound that's basically a tourist attraction, but really it's not about the tourist attraction per se. It's about driving footfall back into Oxford Street and the West End. So come and have a look at that if you're in town. I'm a great believer, finally, and I haven't put this one on the slide, that we will get over the next year or two into a new norm. We will have to have some fixed routines, and I've been quite interested. One of the honours of being elected is you get to talk to lots of people running both business and government departments across London and the country. And I think the one consensus point that everybody says to me, we need some certainty that some people will come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, some may come in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but there's got to be some certainty, because otherwise there will be a lack of certainty, and then that will lead to major issues, including industrial relations issues. So we have to sort that out. Final slide, please. In terms of the property side, I'm conscious that WT will know all these things, being a big consultancy, but I believe this is going to be a huge impact on an industry I've worked in for 30 years in the property industry. There is continual fragmentation, particularly in city centre sites. I don't believe we're going to have so many projects which are single unit projects, i.e. only residential, only office, only retail. The more mixed use, which has already been a huge feature of city development for many years, is here to stay. And in terms of the land that's available to develop, those sites tend to be complex, and with planning requirements as well as the market, it's only going to get more complex, which of course is good for consultants, certainly. Also, there's the point of refurb versus new build. Many people with a green agenda quite rightly ask me continuously, why are we knocking down buildings and then rebuilding from scratch? Why aren't we refurbishing more? And I'm picking up that certainly not just from the green lobby, but also from business. It can be cheaper. I say can be, of course, refurbishment can be quite difficult too. But with COP26 coming up in November, the government conference on the environment, there's a big drive, I believe, for refurb versus new build. In terms of complexity, one of the things I'm really picking up, and this came through with the Cheshire Amersham by-election, that I unfortunately as a Conservative had to go and knock on doors and got an awful lot of good public response, is probably a polite way of putting it. We weren't the most popular on the doorsteps for that by-election. Planning is becoming an even bigger issue. There is a lot of pushback in terms of it won't just be simple to win over stakeholders. The public are suspicious about the forthcoming planning bill. There is no doubt about that. And how we build those new homes and communities is going to be even more challenging. I've not seen the level of the undercurrent that's already there in the communities that I represent and across London and the South East at any time for many, many years. On a positive note, there will be post-COVID winners. It's quite clear, talking to anybody in the development industry broadly, that the projects that they are all focusing on at the moment are public sector, particularly the National Health Service, which clearly always needs reform, and we need to continue to invest in our NHS. They've done a fantastic job for all of us during COVID. Logistics, clearly the terminology, as many of you know, is last mile. Particularly, it is about, you can easily have a warehouse somewhere a long way from our cities, but we also need the last mile, smaller logistics centres in our cities. And existing landowners, you know, there is still an awful lot of need for land, and how you get access to that land and how you build it out is still a huge challenge for everybody. And a glass half full, not half empty, in terms of everybody on this call, because I know there's a lot of unease at the moment with the changes that we're all going through. It has been a very difficult year for many people. People have lost loved ones. It has been a terrible year for many people. My own mother's 91 and in a care home, so I didn't get to see her for much of the year. But I do think that skilled labour, particularly, there are shortages of skilled labour in most sectors. And if you are already in a job, I think you will, even if you did lose your job, I do think there is a very good opportunity if you get in another job quite quickly. And I'm picking up a lot of people are moving around already, both in the public and private. Positive about the future. This is a great workshop for us to really get our head around these issues. And I'll finish as I started by saying thank you to Dean and the team for organising today. And please do come and visit London. We miss you all.
Thanks, Tony. It's really good to hear you picking up, I think, on a lot of those issues that Andrew raised about the changing nature of the city, you know, and from the London, from the capital perspective, you know, so it's still really good for tourists to come. It is going to be evolving. There are going to be more and more things for people to come, and even if it's not in the traditional sense, they're going to be new, travel into the centre, which is great to hear. Liked what you said about bringing in the green aspects as well. So, you know, it has been a car-led recovery, unfortunately, going forward. People do care about the built environment and housing. Can that be done in the greenest possible way going forward? And just that, you know, building on what others have said about the changing use of space, and maybe there's going to be even more mixed use in terms of kind of property in future going forward. And again, picking up on a trend that others have said, that the pandemic really has accelerated trends that were already there. So it's about moving quickly now, and can government respond to that equally as quickly going forward? Thanks. So we're going to hear from Kevin.
Thanks, Siobhan. Kevin Murray from Meter Square Limited. If you go on to the next slide, please. Very briefly, I'm a chartered surveyor like Dean, worked in public and private sector, most recently in the public sector, working for the Cabinet Office and bodies including GPA. 2019, I went back to the private sector, and since then I've been doing an awful lot of work on their facilities management strategy. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll just say a few words about how the Met dealt with the pandemic. Obviously a highly operational business. They're not alone in terms of government bodies like the Home Office have a huge operational output. People like Border Force, visa immigrations, etc. So I think there has been a perception that central government, a lot of staff have worked from home. Well, a lot have worked from home, but an awful lot have had to go into the office. Clearly a big challenge for the Met Police. Most of their buildings are a mix of operational and office accommodation. Clearly police officers can't work from home. So the Met had to keep their buildings open, and it also required a lot of civilian support to keep the police service going in London. They reacted very, very quickly to the lockdown announced on the 23rd of March, and informative comms to staff that did have to go into the office, largely to provide assurance and make sure that the police service could keep running with the requisite support. They immediately increased cleaning regimes. I wouldn't say they were lucky, but the fact that a lot of retail closed, a lot of hotels closed, meant there was quite a lot of cleaning staff that were available, and the Met took full use of that. The other thing they also did was they switched all of the ventilation to being wholly sourced from fresh air rather than recirculated air. Again, giving assurance to people that continue to go to work through the pandemic. This was supplemented on the slide there. That sign went up into one of their buildings at the end of March last year. They really were very well prepared and were very quick to react. To the next slide, I'll just say a few words about implications for working practices. Kate spoke very clearly about smarter working. I think it's fair to say that smarter working has been around central government for quite a long time. I joined Ministry of Justice in 2010. When I joined, I had my own desk. I even had a visitor desk. But by 2013, the MOJ were piloting smarter working, where for every 10 members of staff, 4 desks were provided. I know this is a few key. It was initially difficult to manage, but if people are organised, it can be done. I'd say some of the issues around this hybrid working that will need to be addressed, particularly through the use of things like Zoom and Teams, is that there is certainly a noise issue. Working within offices, if somebody's on a Zoom or a Teams call, it can be quite noisy, and there can be a lack of privacy. Things like pods have been brought in a bit easier, but it's certainly something that will need to be addressed. Kate also spoke about space standards, as did Tony a few minutes ago. I think what's interesting with space standards is there's been a general push to reduce the metre squared allocated to each member of staff with reduced size workstations. I think with hybrid working and the need for teams to meet, I think people do need to meet face to face. That is almost going to certainly prompt increased use of meeting rooms, conference facilities, whether that's within government buildings or people step into that market to provide that space, will actually be quite interesting potential opportunity for that. In terms of government policy, I'll actually start with something I put at the end. Obviously, a big push for reducing carbon emissions to get to net zero carbon by 2050. The first lockdown in March last year through to June, there were absolutely significant reductions in carbon emissions and air pollution because of the result of reduced travel and reduced traffic. Carbon emissions and air pollution is rising again. We did actually continue to work through that period with a huge benefit in reduction in carbon emissions. Tony mentioned the point around new buildings against refurbishment of existing. It's a huge challenge. Reports last week were saying that to actually get to zero carbon could be a potential impact of 400 billion spend required. Just going back more towards the pandemic, big government policy initiative, GPA, were basically brought in to deliver the hubs. And I think that's going to be quite interesting because as people have worked at home, what will those hubs look like? And actually, where will they be located? I've mentioned about the ambitious space standards for people working in government already. So workstations, will they reduce? Will there be bigger conference facilities? And in terms of the wider levelling up, I think that there does need to be a slight reach to the messaging around that. I live in a small town in Cambridgeshire, and during this pandemic, I would say that most local businesses, certainly local shops, once they're allowed to open, have benefited from the fact that more people are working from home. But there has been a bit of a concentration about the impact on cities. And I accept that there may be an impact on cities benefits for towns and villages to actually benefit from increased home working. And I've already mentioned before about the reductions in carbon emissions. I think the other thing also that would need to be addressed if we go through this again is big government policy for increasing government spend with SMEs. I think that also needs to extend trying to get public spending more. With during the last lockdown, I think the fact that very large organisations like the big supermarkets did actually step up to the plate. They stayed open. Hopefully that won't have a long-term impact on smaller business. Certainly where I live, a number have closed because of the fact they couldn't open. So I think that will be something, if this happens again, what we would need to do. So I think if this does happen again, or really hopefully we don't get another wave, is I think we are better prepared to work remotely. I think it gives a good platform. It's difficult to find positives out of this pandemic, but I think we have learned an awful lot over the last 18 months. And so I think it does give us a good basis for hopefully regrowing the economy and getting back to business. Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I don't know if it's because we won the football last night, but it's nice that everybody's had such optimistic presentations and not just talked about the challenges, but also focused on the opportunities going forward. So really good to hear that how an organisation like the Met Police adapted itself. You gave really good examples there, and also each of workplace design going forward and how that might change. And then again, picking up on what some other people have said about how this might impact on local high streets as well as those big city centres, and the need to consider maybe support for small businesses in a different way going forward as well. So thank you everybody so much for those opening presentations. We have got so many questions coming in. I'm going to actually pick up on one of those ones that you just mentioned there. Let me just say about those local hubs. And somebody has said, should it be, it's not a kind of either or about working from home or working in the office, but it is very much about, could we have those kind of public sector hubs? So that's one question. So could we have some kind of a network of more locally? And then also on the kind of geography point, Keith Stadler, a message in the first question, which was, with flexible working, is there a risk that jobs will be offshored to countries where wages are cheaper? And I want to add to that, to saying, actually, it's something that, Dean, that you said is, will geography matter actually going forward? Could you be working from anywhere? And what implications might that have for the levelling up agenda? So those two things, should there be a kind of network of public sector hubs that people could go and work from? And could you be working from anywhere, you know, or will stuff be outsourced, and is that a risk? So you can answer one or both of those questions. Dean, we haven't heard from you for a while. I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, I think some very interesting points there. I'll start with the international question first. I think from W2's point of view as an international practice, I think the answer is absolutely yes. You know, there is not just a risk, but I would equally say an opportunity. We've seen as a practice that with international travel being limited, that we've been able to offer advice and guidance to clients, but remotely, and utilising all the technology that we're using now. And we're also aware, with speaking to colleagues in South Africa, about expertise to other countries, that they don't have that expertise locally, but they can now access it far more readily. So I think there is a risk. I think there is a potential that services will lose that geographical bias. And if we think there's not a geographical constraint in the UK, well then frankly, why should there be a geographical constraint across national boundaries. So I think it absolutely is the case, and it would be foolish to imagine that those boundaries don't break down more as we go forward as well. But as with everything else we discussed today, it is to actually sell our services, and indeed the public sector could sell its services and support to other countries and provide the expertise that we absolutely have in this country, but to a wider audience. And so that's it's a bit of a lateral thinking opportunity, I think, that presents. And just quickly moving on to the hubs question, I think, isn't it right? Wouldn't it be an absolutely ideal scenario where you use this opportunity, where space is created by the public sector, but also the private sector together into a hub facility? And even in a very small way, WT over the course of the last 18 months, we have looked at and reviewed our offices, and we've created new hub offices. We have opened new spaces to be literally a drop-in place that anyone can utilise. They may not be based there, but it gives us a geographical ability to service our clients when we are visiting site, because there's a big chunk of our work that is physically based. And using a more flexible hub arrangement that ultimately could be, you've got the benefit of collaboration that should create. It really is a very good and innovative way of dealing, I think, with the potential increase in space that's available, but equally utilising the space that organisations currently have far more efficiently.
Thanks. Kate, I could see you nodding there. Is this idea of hubs something that the government is thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. And actually the plans and much of the work to implement government hubs has been in place for a number of years. So it was pre-COVID, starting off with HMRC create, and now the GPA is working through quite a long pipeline really of hubs in various towns and cities throughout the United Kingdom. And the purpose really of the hubs is that they provide a great place for government departments to come together, to work together. We really think that the workplace is still so important for what we phrase as 4 Cs, so connection.
Oh, I think has Kate. Yeah, I think Kate has dropped off for a moment. She will come back in a questions that we've had come in, which Tony, I'm going to put to you first. You mentioned, oh, there's Kate. She's back in the room. Sorry, Kate.
Sincere apologies.
Tony,
the Wi-Fi was a bit dodgy. Shall I just carry on quickly? Well,
yes,
yeah. So I was just saying that we see the hubs as being critical for departments to, 4 Cs I mentioned. I don't know whether you got that, but connection, creativity, caring, and collaboration. And the approach that we're taking to hubs is they're open to government departments. A government department has to some space within the hub, but we want to see multiple, departments working together in one place. Each department will have their own sort of home zone, but there'll be many areas within the hub where they can come together, share ideas, perhaps share ways of working. And we think these are going to be critical. So they'll be in parts of, cities and towns across the country, great access, great transport towards the hubs, great working facilities. And I think as part of sort of the levelling up, they're really going to be critical as we see some roles moving away from London. Obviously, there will still be a good deal that don't necessarily need to be in Whitehall, moving out to hubs. So a great opportunity for departments. As I said, departments need to sort of buy into the concept, but they'll get first class, workplaces that really support the ways of working of civil servants across the United Kingdom. I think there's a really important point as well, is that it brings people closer to the local citizens that they serve, and that's really important for the civil service. So points in terms of outsourcing, I think, personal opinion, but so much of what we do in the civil service is about local citizens, and actually being in a place that we can better serve those local citizens is really important.
Thanks. I am going to come to Tony and Kevin in a minute on 2 different questions on this particular issue.
Yes, thanks, Siobhan. I know you wanted to move on to the question, but just if I could come back on to part of Keith's question about the flexible working and overseas. I don't think the risk here is about the low wages. I think it is a fantastic opportunity because it's a door that opens in both directions. And I think the risk with that is that if we don't legislate for it correctly, that we will see some companies misusing and unfairly using cheap labour overseas through this way, maybe getting and cutting off the ability for us to actually help and support overseas workers in a way that that Dean mentioned earlier on.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks so much. I'm going to move on to two other questions that we had, and they were about skills and training. So I wanted to come to Tony because he'd mentioned that in his presentation. So one is, with this new type of thinking around urban centres, for example, do we have the right professionals in place, the kind of right city planners in place? And if not, should we be talking to kind of higher education universities about that now, so that we have the right people coming through the pipeline? The chat about the skills of managing hybrid teams in future. Kevin, you mentioned this a little bit about some of the challenges of hybrid working in office spaces, for example. So Tony, I'm going to come to you first, and then Kevin on kind of the skills area, and do we need to think about this urgently?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole skills agenda it was important before COVID. It's now even more important. I mean, the reality is the GLA did set up if you like, a third sector organisation for planners, for very successful. But like the biggest issue in the whole development industry, the guy running it was so good he was stolen by a competitor and went to run a business in Scandinavia, actually. But yes, shortage of good people, I think, is going to be really key. It's good in terms of those that have got jobs, but it's going to be really key for the rest of the workforce, and particularly youth unemployment. I've got hotspots in my constituency at the moment where 25% of people are unemployed at the moment. So training is going to be absolutely critical. And what I'd say to all those who are experienced or quite experienced is, please help those below you in the career path, because I think the issue will be, I think talking to particularly senior managers during COVID, bluntly, most people on this call would have been okay so long as they didn't catch COVID during the last 16 months, because they got the experience, the professional background. They could just get on with their job as they were probably doing before COVID, with flexibility. What I picked up from young professionals particularly, and a number of them are conduction, is they felt young professionals often single, are living on their own in small flats and haven't felt supported by their bosses quite often. So if we are now going to say that perhaps as the civil servant, Kate's excellent presentation said, that people want to work 3.3 days a week at home, I would question, with the greatest respect, that they've still got to manage their line team members and help them their career development. I think it's for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Kevin, and then Dean, I'm going to come to you on this issue of managing hybrid teams. Kevin, you mentioned it in your presentation.
Yeah, certainly, well, going back 8 years now, having 4 desks for 10 people did require a huge amount of liaison, not just within my team, but also with other teams, to make sure that we weren't overcrowding the workspace. And I think it was also the fact of having the ability for people to work at home 8 years ago, which does seem a long time ago now, and it was quite novel at the time. So I think there's that logistics piece about who is in, not just in your team, but in other teams. Certainly think managing calls is quite a big issue. I think compared to how things were when Zoom and Teams started, I think it's got better. I worked with Dean probably 10, 12 years ago now with General Electric, and their default was calls. And to say that was a steep learning curve is an understatement. It was highly, well, it was highly time zones. We didn't have Zoom Teams. You didn't always know who was speaking, so you had to be very, very careful to try and log who was speaking. I think, as I say, I think the management of calls has improved, but I think there's a fair way to go. to really get the benefit out of that hybrid working. I think there is a challenge around flexible working in that people that do flexi time or compressed hours, that can be very difficult to manage if you've got people doing compressed hours and working from home. Unless there is a core set of hours, it can be very, very difficult at convenient times. The risk is the working day for some just extends and extends. So if you're a manager and you have a number of staff, and you've got some staff that are, working from 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, whatever. Others perhaps have childcare, and that they're kind of splitting the day. That does become quite difficult, and it can become quite exhausting for managers, and then their working day extends. I think the other thing, and in terms of is that assurance that people need that it is going to be safe when they return. And I think the workplace is one thing, and I think there's most departments that provide that assurance. I think that the big risk for the return to work is people's concern around travel, and how that's going to work out. I'll finish. I'll just come back to a point somebody else made about local authorities and central government perhaps occupying the same buildings. The one public estate initiative for a number of years, Office of Government Property, look after that with support from GPA. So that is definitely a government initiative for more shared space.
Thank you. Dean, you wanted to come in quickly on this one.
Yeah, just some very, very quick comments. I think that the bottom line managing flexible workforces is technology. There's no two ways about it. It is expanding on the technology that we've got used to with these sorts of calls. But certainly from our organisation's point of view, we've implemented things like logging systems. So that people, for our staff, we need to make sure that if they are working alone, even if that's at home, that we're looking after their health and well-being. And so, logging systems so that we know where people are, and managing actually things like holiday as well. Certainly when, how do you know when somebody's on holiday or working or not? I think there is also a very crucial point, just building on what Kevin said. It's absolutely right. We've got to be careful that the work-life balance doesn't actually go completely the wrong way. And even if people are at home, they're just never leaving work. They're not putting their devices down. But equally, flip side, recognising that if people are working from home, well, why shouldn't they do a call in the evening if that's better for them, if in fact they've got, let's say, childcare needs during the day? And that flexibility around how people manage their time will have a direct impact on the environment that they work in. I mean, it will be when they choose to access public services. It will impact on when they choose to get their shopping. All of those things have that there's that kind of mushroom working. It's just not about, are you working at home or are you in the office? It's about the time that you spend and how how that time is worked through. And technology has got to be the answer and the driver, but it is going to have an impact, obviously, on the built environment that we're in. And just an interesting point in terms of telephony, one of the things that again, we've done in the UK as a business is actually create a central telephone facility that then can access people anywhere that they are through again, IT. So that, I think for public sector, bodies, central facilities, but then enable, the sensible distribution of phone calls and messages is going to be an essential way of dealing with that. And the whole Internet of Things, which Kate, I think you referred to in terms of booking systems and booking space and, logging and seeing whether, even dust, the waste paper bins are emptied and if meeting rooms are free and having that kind of app functionality to access spaces in a more dynamic way, conversant, more and more comfortable with technology, have been forced to be so perhaps over the last 18 months. And that technology interface with property use and will enable hubs to work and will enable people to book rooms where they need it and to interact with colleagues. And that then feeds back, I think, to what Tony was saying, is that ultimately, if we do all of that properly, we can make sure that we are in the right place to support our more junior members of staff and to nurture them and bring them forward. Because this isn't about being in the office or being at home. It is a blend, it is a hybrid of those.
Thanks, Dean. We're almost out of time. We might run over by 1 or 2 minutes, but just in 30 seconds before I hand back to Dean in a moment. But in 30 seconds, there are 2 questions that you can answer, one or both. And just to say to the audience, thank you so much for sending in so many brilliant questions. Don't worry if they haven't been answered now. There are some to specific panel members, some general. We will get those all answered for you after the webinar, so you will get a response on email after the webinar. But in just a couple of seconds, I'm going to put to every panel member, there's 2 questions there. One, has any evaluation been done on the impact of more home workers, so if people start working and moving further from city centres? And the other one, what was the other one? Oh yes, are costs simply being transferred to staff? So are they going to be, if they're working from home, are they going to be taking on board costs of kind of, you know, using computers at home, heating, printing, all of those kind of things at home? So please answer one of those in about 20 seconds. Andrew, I'm going to start with you.
Great, thanks, George. I'll deal with the second question, if I may. I think for us about it, because I don't think it's a straightforward position. I think some people will actually save by not having to travel into the office every day because of commuting costs, and others won't, and they may be incurring costs in terms of electricity and heating at home. So I'm not sure it's a one size fits all, and that in itself brings in a challenge. For us as a business, it's something that we are monitoring going forward to make sure that we come up with the correct answer and the fair answer at the point in time we can.
Thanks, Andrew. Kate, from you very quickly.
Yeah, and I'll answer. During the pandemic, obviously every department treats this slightly differently, and some, you know, it's an emergency situation, so some did provide allowances, some provided kit at home. But as Andrew very much said, I think we're still learning about what is the best approach, and there won't be a one size fits all. I think the really important thing to remember in this, though, is that yes, we were many of us forced to work from home during the pandemic, but as we move into the future, actually it will be about choice, about what's right for the business first, but obviously the individual as well. So I think what we're saying is it has to be right for the individual. If that's going to the office, then it's going to the office. If it's working at home, working at home from home, and therefore increase perhaps their cost of electricity. I think it has to be about what is that individual situation and where they can best work. Now, as Andrew said, there may be some savings for some, it may cost slightly more for others, and maybe an offset, but it's very difficult, and it's not a one size fits all.
Thanks, Kate. Kevin.
I'm going to have to answer the second one as well. I know departments have provided furniture, etc. to staff. I think, as Andrew said, I think it's a balance. I think some people would have saved a lot through not commuting, but those that didn't have a long commute, it may well be costing them more.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
I better do the house price. Everybody else has done the other question. The answer is London and Manchester are not doing as well as the rest of the country, bar Scotland, which doesn't seem to be having much of a boom. That's obviously more to do with stamp duty, but it's also to do with the home working. But really, the answer to whether it will continue if the person lives in some nice bit of Wiltshire is it depends on whether these hubs come in and whether they have to be mainly going into a city centre or not. You know, I think the jury's still open at the moment. We'll know in a couple of years. But if you look, Savills have got a lot of research on this. They're already doing, as many of the other big property consultancies as well. So, and I'm sure WT will have a view on this. I should quickly say for Dean.
Thanks so much, Tony. Yeah, I mean, just to say, first of all, you know, my professional body of the RICS are absolutely researching this, and indeed have already issued some initial findings, such as Rightmove, and I guess you have to consider whether there is a kind of a biased view there. But all indications so far is that the where there has been any kind of activity or indeed boom in the market over the course of the pandemic period, that has predominantly been in out of city centre locations and into more remote locations, which comes back to, I think, the point I had on my first slide of, you know, are we facing a scenario where people may travel less, but they may travel further when they do need to access hubs or central city locations, making sure that the infrastructure is there to support them in that way, both when they are working remotely, but also when they are working and meeting with their teams.
Thanks, Dean. Before I hand over to you, Dean, to give some closing summary of kind of the discussion, I just want to say to the audience again, thank you so much. And from me, thank you to the panel as well. To the audience, you will have received a questionnaire. Please take a couple of minutes if you can to fill that in. It'll be in your inboxes now. It's just so that we can make sure we give you the best possible events going forward. And also very, very topical, this has come up quite a lot in the discussion, Global Government Forum are actually running 2 training events, one on Thursday, the 15th of July on the subject of leading a remote policy team, and one on Thursday, the 22nd of July on performing effectively in the remote office. So all details to respond if you want to get on one of those places are very limited. With that, I'm going to hand back to Dean. We started with you, Dean. We're going to finish. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, just literally to wrap up, no more than a minute or so. So I think let's be honest, the change that we're going through, as other panelists have said, change is not new, but the rate of change is definitely faster at the moment. That's borne by technology, it's borne by the pandemic, and indeed other agendas that are around in terms of environmental initiatives. It's the opportunity for us, an exciting opportunity for public sector, private sector to look and come up with a better way of working going forwards, to use all of the technology that's there. And we don't need to be as shy about it as we had been perhaps before, because it's been tested, that's been forced upon us. I think, looking at the various statistics, there is no doubt there is going to be a reduction in the demand for office space. There is going to be a change in retail. But what we're all very good at, and certainly the UK is particularly good at that opportunity. I think overall, hybrid working in a different way, extending the working day perhaps, but enabling hopefully a better work-life balance is really what we've got to be aiming for all of society and public sector employees in particular, to make sure that we can deliver the best possible services. So I think I would like to just add my thanks to Siobhan's, for my colleagues on the panel. It's just amazed how quickly the time has gone, but I really appreciate your views and your support. And I thank everyone that's joined in the webinar this afternoon, and have a good evening, and enjoy the rest of the week, and look forward to the weekend. And there might be something happening on Sunday that you might want to pay attention to. Thanks again.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you. Bye now.